And this is Paul Rose. Paul is a historian at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to let him give a more in-depth introduction of who he is and what he is here to talk about today.
And there we go. Okay, well, thank you, Catherine, for having me, and thank you, everyone, for taking a little time to listen to this. I just want to give a little bit of introduction before we go ahead and begin. It's like Catherine said, I'm a research historian at the Holocaust Museum. I've been there over 25 years, and exhibitions work is my forte, but I do a lot of other different things there and do a lot of other kind of historical investigations and brief writing and curatorship. This talk is strictly unofficial as far as the museum is concerned. I'm not speaking as an employee of the museum, but strictly in a private capacity about history, why it's important, why I like it, why I think it's important. The library asked me to give a few talks, and they asked me to talk about what I thought was important to me, and I said history for more reasons than people probably know. And she said, great topic. So just want to stress that history is not just the 900 shelves in the library that most people kind of pass by, but it's actually fascinating field of study, but a very important field of study for reasons you probably haven't even thought of. And if you have, I'm happy to validate your worldview. So let's go ahead and get started. Catherine's helped me put together a little PowerPoint to just kind of move this along. And then we can start on the first frame.
Oh, come on.
Okay, mine's looking a little off.
Yes, sorry, Paul.
It's okay.
What? I did this a second ago and it was fine. I'm gonna
do
it again.
Well, that's how they know that this is live and not some prepackaged amazing presentation.
All right, I'm gonna try this one more time.
No problem. Again, I've given a couple other talks. They were a lot of fun. The library was very, very nice to invite me to talk about this stuff. I know there's a lot going on today and this year, so I think it'd be fun to take our minds off of anything else that might be on our minds or in the news. And while she sets this up, I'll just kind of keep rambling on a little bit. Always been very interested in history, and I studied it in school. I was going to be a completely different kind of historian, but I kind of segued into 20th century genocide and Holocaust history. But that's not exactly what this talk is about today. It's really just about history in general. So Catherine, are you still there? Are we still going to start this up? Okay. It looks like I am going to be hosting this now. So it looks like she might have lost her internet. So if people can just bear with me for 1 second. I have her presentation, the PowerPoint that she helped me make up, and I'm going to open that up right now. And I'm going to use hers. Here we go. And that way, I'll run this thing and right, view, present. Okay, 1 second. I have to do share screen, so if you'll just give me 1 moment. Sorry about these technical difficulties, but we're really very close to starting. Okay. All right, now we're going to go ahead and start. This is the importance of history. First, I'm going to give a general definition of history. History is basically the knowledge of and the study of the past. It's the story of the past in a form of collective memory for human beings. History is the story of not only who we are and where we come from, but also it can potentially reveal where we're heading. History is very important to study because it's a very essential for all of us in understanding ourselves and the world around us, because there's a history of everything in every possible field and topic. Medicine, music, art, all of it has a history, and all of it's important to the development of those disciplines in our lives, and for the future of them. To know and understand history is absolutely necessary, even though the results of history, historical study, they're not immediately visible, but they're, we're going to get to exactly why they are so important. Now, when most of us think about our childhood school days, you always remembered some kids, you might be one of them, who thought that history was very boring. It's just a jumble of names and dates attached to events so long ago and people who are long dead. And why is history important? I just don't, some people would have asked, I don't get this. Why do we need to study this? They didn't know then that history was probably one of the most important subjects they or you would ever study. So we're going to take a closer look at why history is important, and we're going to explore why everyone should make a point to study it in depth, if not generally. All right, history helps us develop a better understanding of the world. You can't build a framework on which to base your life without understanding how things work in the world. History paints us a detailed picture of how society, technology, and government worked way back when, so we can better understand how it works now. And it helps us determine how to approach the future, and allows us to learn from our mistakes as well as the triumphs. History is not just studying everything that was wrong about human progress and development, but also the really wonderful things that we've achieved. It's a nice blend of the two. Here's some interesting photos of the library in Timbuktu. It's one of the most famous and most amazing libraries really in the history of the world. A lot of people know about the Library of Alexandria, and they know about the great libraries in Europe later. But the library in Timbuktu was one of the largest repositories of ancient and classic history and culture and literature, as well as Middle Eastern culture. And there's a really great book if you ever get a chance to read it. And here's the copy of the front page of it. So history helps us to learn to understand other people. This is really important. You shouldn't just study your own history or what you think your own history is, but it's important to understand everybody. Studying history, it allows us to observe and understand how people and societies behaved. For example, we're able to evaluate war, even when a nation is at peace, by looking back at previous events. History gives us the data that's used to create laws or theories about various aspects of society. And history isn't just an essential introduction to your own country or ethnic heritage and ancestry. Like I said, it's also a really valuable tool when it comes to understanding people who are different from us. Global, national, and regional history books, it really helps us understand how other cultures affect our own culture. They encourage us to develop a greater appreciation for multicultural influences on our own communities. I mean, this is exactly why everyone should study some African American history, immigrant history, or so forth, regardless of their own cultural background. Because really, history of the world affects everything else. Here's, the printing press was actually, Chinese well before Gutenberg came onto the scene. Just wanted to put a few photos in here to talk about, immigrant history. And some of the, some of the more sensitive topics and things that people don't really know much about, and they don't like to discuss in detail, or that are glossed over as far as our history too. And this will eventually make everyone a better person. History helps us understand ourselves, who we are. To understand who you are, you need to develop a sense of self. It has to be a true sense. It has to be based on truth. A large part of that is learning where you fit into the story of how your country or the global community, in the grand scheme of things, it tells you the story of how your country, your town, your community came to be, and everything that it is. It tells you where your ancestors came from. It tells you who they were. But more importantly, it gives you the ability to spot and to appreciate the legacies that you inherited from these people. History helps us, provide us with a sense of identity. This is actually one of the main reasons history is still taught in schools all over the world. Historians have been able to learn about how countries, families, and groups were formed, how they evolved and developed over time. But when an individual takes it upon themselves to dive deep into their own family's history, they can understand how their family interacted with a larger historical change. Did that family serve in a war? Major wars? Were they present during significant historical events? And as far as present day issues, history helps us understand these present day issues by asking deep questions as to why things are and why they are. Why did wars in Europe in the 20th century matter to countries around the world? How did Hitler gain and maintain power for as long as he had? How has this had an effect on shaping the world and our global political system today? This is, all answered by history. Here's a picture of the brown shirts protesting and boycotting in Nazi Germany. Here's another photo similar to that. And here's some photos from not very long ago. I mean, people think that these kinds of incidents are ancient history and no longer relevant today, but when you learn this history and understand why it's important, you can learn how to spot warning signs of it repeating again. Nothing, everything old is new again. It's really important to understand how these events take shape, how these trends can be spotted, and to identify them and understand them for what they really are and for the threat that they can be to our society. So let's see here. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how you really shouldn't sugarcoat or whitewash history. There's been a trend in this country and a lot of other countries to only present the most positive aspects and spin on a nation's history. And in doing that, you really lose so much. If you don't base your current self, your current philosophies, your current ideologies or political views on fact and truth, then really, in effect, you're living a lie. When I was a much younger boy, many decades ago, I only learned in school the positive, glorious, heroic aspects of the Western contact with North and South America in the 15th and 16th centuries. Didn't know anything about the horrors of them until much later. And only under a lot of self-investigation. I know some people think, well, you really shouldn't introduce these harsh topics and these dark truths to young children because they wouldn't understand it or they're not ready for it. But really, if you're not telling them, at least in some form, the truth of a matter, of a historical event, then really you're setting them up for the same kind of deception that a lot of people sell to themselves. They're not basing their identity on fact. And if you base your identity and your worldview on a myth, you're really building your castles on sand. You're not, it's just, you're not being truthful with yourself, and you're not living a truthful life. History makes us better decision makers. Those that do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. I know we've all heard those words before. They were first spoken by George Santayana, and they're still very relevant today because of how true they are. History gives us the opportunity to learn from these mistakes. It helps us understand the many reasons why people behave the way they do. And as a result, it helps us become more compassionate as people and more impartial as decision makers. Our whole judicial system is a perfect example of this concept at work. If you want to really understand why something happened in any area or field, such as why one political party won the last election versus another, or why a major change in the number of smokers happened, you need to look for the factors that took place earlier. It's only through the study of history can people really see and grasp the reasons behind these changes. And only through history can we understand what elements of an institution or society continue regardless of continual change. History gives you the tools to be decent citizens. Good citizens are always informed citizens, and no one can consider himself to be an informed citizen without a working knowledge of history. This is the case whether we're talking about our role in the community in regards to our nation on the whole. History, it helps you become better voters and more effective members of any type of society. It helps us, it puts us in a position to be, to better inform others as well. There's a few images that are coming up that are a little bit harsh, but I wanted to not put these in so much for shock value, but just as to show that, history, it's not always pleasant, and it sometimes makes you confront very, very harsh and strong truths that I think it's important for us to deal with. History helps us become better informed citizens. It shows us who we are as a collective group, and being informed of this is a key element in maintaining a democratic society. This knowledge, it helps people take an active role in the political forum through educated debates and by refining people's core beliefs. With a thorough knowledge of history, citizens can change their old belief systems. The study of history, really, it's a non-negotiable aspect of better citizenship. This is one of the main reasons why it's taught in school curriculums. People that push for citizenship history, the relationship between the citizen and the state, they just want to promote strong national identity and even a national loyalty through the teaching of lessons of individual and collective success. So the Chinese American history. Understanding past events and how they impact the world today, it brings about empathy and understanding for groups of people whose history may be very different from the mainstream or from yours. You understand more the sufferings and the joy and the chaos that were necessary for the present day to happen, and appreciate all that you're able to benefit from those past efforts. It goes without saying that change can be a very difficult concept to understand. Each of us has a very different experience with the rest of the world, and an experience shaped by societal norms, cultural differences, personal experiences, and more. But we know when we as individuals crave change and why, but history helps us better understand how, when, and why change occurs or should be sought on a much larger scale. So some different, protest pictures from both different sides of all over the political spectrum. Some of the different issues that people fought for, that they thought was important for them, and why knowing these kinds of things is important to understand today. Basically, I think basic theme of what I'm trying to say is that history teaches morals and values. They're not arbitrary. They're based on fact. By looking at specific stories of individuals and situations, you can test your own morals and values. You can compare it to some real and difficult situations individuals have had to face in very trying times. Looking to people who faced and overcome adversity, it can be inspiring. You can study the great people of history who successfully worked through moral dilemmas, and also ordinary people who teach us lessons in courage, persistence, and protest. We learn from the past and we notice the clear warning signs. When you learn from past atrocities against groups of people, genocides, wars, and attacks, through this collective suffering, we learn to pay attention to the warning signs leading up to these atrocities. Society has been able to take these warning signs and fight against them when they see them in the present day. And knowing what events led up to these various wars, it helps us better influence our future. History, it helps develop a new level of appreciation for really just about everything. History is more than just the living record of nations, leaders, and wars. It's the story of us. It's the story of human beings. It's packed with tales of how someone stood up for what they believed in, or died, or for love, or worked hard to make their dreams come true. All those things are concepts that we can relate to. It's very enriching to know. So Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Martin Luther King, these are very inspiring people, and not without their, warts. No human being is perfect. This is the more, I wanted to give like some basic definitions and talk about the basic talking points. We can get to more later. We can go through a really extensive question and answer if you want, but that's really the general importance of history section of the talk today. I'm going to give a few examples, specific examples, and then you can go ahead and start to ask some questions. Okay, now I put this up there from John Adams because he did not like the way he was portrayed in the press at all, and didn't think it was very fair, some of the things that people were saying about him, but took it to a bit of an extreme. If you know anything about the sedition laws, fake news is not a recent phenomenon. When we talk about fake news, requires a little bit of clarification. There was a paper published in 2017 that came up with 6 distinct definitions of fake news after examining 34 different articles from all over the world. There's like new satire, which applies to like the Daily Show, that uses humor to contextualize and mock real world events. There's parody, like The Onion, and there's propaganda created by the state to influence public perceptions. And that's definitely a form of fake news. Manipulation of photos or videos to create a false narrative. We've been seeing a lot of this on social media. There's a GIF of Emma Gonzalez tearing up the Constitution when in reality, she was tearing up a gun target poster. Before the Revolutionary War, arsonists burned down Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house in Massachusetts and burned it to the ground over the Stamp Act, even though he was a loyalist and he was not in favor of the tax. The quote is that they were old men, young men, and boys barely enough to read, all of them jacked up on 90 proof Sam Adams prose. So this is very similar to, the shooting that took place a few years ago in DC Pizza, inspired by fake news. So these kinds of violent acts inspired by false narratives, real danger can come out of them. James Madison, he understood the power of public opinion. In 1791, the same year the Bill of Rights was ratified, Madison said, "Public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one." I mean, there's a lot more I can say about this period, this era of history, but I will gloss over that and move on. But whether it's, fake news fabrications like those promulgated by the Sons of Liberty or fake news stories that in reality break down to a difference of opinion, the trade-offs of having a free and independent press has been part of American politics since the beginning. Madison, had a quote where he said, you have to tolerate some sedition in order to have free communication. You can't root it all out. So this, I want to talk a little bit about historical negationism. Historical negationism, it's also called denialism. It's a distortion of the historical record. And it's not the same as historical revisionism. That's a broader term, extends to newly evidenced or fairly reasoned academic interpretations. In attempting to revise the past, illegitimate historical revisionism may use techniques inadmissible in a proper historical debate, such as presenting known forged documents as genuine, inventing ingenious but implausible reasons for distrusting genuine documents, attributing conclusions to books and sources that actually report the opposite, manipulating statistical series to support a given point of view, and just deliberately mistranslating text. This happens a lot more than you would think. Now, there's countries like Germany that have actually criminalized negationist revision of certain historical events. Others take a more cautious position for various reasons, such as the protections of free speech, which is extremely important, and others mandate negationist views. It's official state policy. Examples of negationism is Holocaust denial. The Turkish government refuses to admit anything about the Armenian genocide. And in this country, controversially, there's the lost cause of the Confederacy, which we'll get into a little bit more later. There's the myth of the clean German soldier. There's Japanese war crimes denials, which are in some quarters of the Japanese government official policy. In literature, the consequences of historical negationism have been very imaginatively depicted in many different works of fiction, like 1984 by George Orwell. And today, unfortunately, negationism is rife and rampant in the online social media and the internet. Now, libraries, these repositories of literature, they've been targeted throughout history. Library of Alexandria, the Library of Baghdad, burning of the liturgical and historical books of St. Thomas, Christians by the Archbishop Goa de Mendes, and recently there's the 1981 burning of the Jaffna Library, and destruction of Iraqi libraries by ISIS in the fall of Mosul. An attack on libraries is a form of negationism, and book burning is a form of negationism. So let's talk a little bit about revisionism, historical revision, which is a little different. And I'm going to use the example of this lost cause of the Confederacy, or the neo-Confederate. Historical negationism of the American Civil War revisionists and neo-Confederates, they claim that the Confederate States, 1861 to 65, were the defenders rather than the instigators of the American Civil War, and that the Confederacy's motivation for secession from the United States was the maintenance of Southern states' rights and limited government, rather than the preservation and expansion of slavery of African Americans. Regarding this, I'm going to quote historian Brooke Simpson. This is an active attempt to reshape historical memory, an effort by white Southerners to find historical justifications for present-day actions. The neo-Confederate movement's ideologues have grasped that they can control how people remember the past. They'll control how people approach the present and future. Ultimately, this is a very conscious war for memory and heritage. It's a quest for legitimacy, the eternal quest for justification. Now, this really, to me, this really says it all. If you can control and create a completely different narrative of history, of what actually happened and why it happened, you can control people today and control how they think tomorrow, that you can actually reshape society to whatever your ends. And this is such an extremely dangerous thing. I've had so many, I've actually even stopped debating with friends about the Civil War, because when they try to bring up this argument, and they're very sincere about it, it's how they were raised and what they were taught. But when I try to explain to them just how new this concept is and how it's related to the American Civil Rights Movement, and how, if you just read the congressional record and the speeches and the newspaper articles that these people were doing back in the 1860s in the South, it was absolutely about slavery, and they're very upfront about it, and it's in every secessionist argument. It's a matter of public record, like I said, in the congressional record and in the senators' speeches. You just can't deny this, but that's usually just glossed over, ignored, and people want to talk about this whole heritage aspect and completely gloss over some of the the real reasons why this took place. And it's very difficult for some people to accept. They've created this identity of who they are and who their family is based on this whole idea of this lost cause South and good old Dixie. And really, I mean, people say, well, why is that so bad? Why can't I just think what I want? Why can't I believe the stories I was told? Because really, again, you're basing who you are and your identity on a lie, and it makes your life a lie, and it's very dangerous in how you're going to interact with other people and the political choices you're going to make. So I know this example might ruffle a few feathers, but in the early 20th century, Mildred Rutherford, the historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, led the attack against American history textbooks that did not present the lost cause of the Confederacy, that version of the Civil War. To that end, Rutherford assembled a massive collection of documents that included essay contests on the glory of the Ku Klux Klan and personal tributes to faithful slaves. About this kind of negationism of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, there's a historian, David Blight, who says that all UDC members and leaders were not as virulently racist as Rutherford, but all, in the name of a reconciled nation, participated in this enterprise that deeply influenced white supremacist vision of Civil War memory. I'm not going to pick on just the United States or even the South. This next picture is also a little bit disturbing, so I'll tell you when it's gone, but it's about to come up. There's a huge effort in Japan by the right wing of that government to negate or deny any of the atrocities that took place in Japan or under countries under sphere of Japanese influence. The post-war minimization of the war crimes of the Japanese imperialism is an example of illegitimate historical revisionism. Contemporary Japanese revisionists, such as Tojo's granddaughter, Yuko Iwanami, proposed that Japan's invasion of China in World War II were justified reactions to racist Western imperialism. In 2007, Prime Minister Abe denied that the military had forced women into sexual slavery during the war, saying, "The fact is, there's no evidence to prove there was coercion." And before he spoke, Liberal Democratic Party sought to revise the apology that was made to the comfort women 10 years earlier. And they're also trying to negate what happened during the 6-week Nanking massacre in 1937 and 1938. Shinzo Abe, he led the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform and headed the Diet Antenna of Nippon Kagi. It's two openly revisionist groups that are denying Japanese war crimes. The Yasukuni Shrine runs a museum where they show items in order to encourage and worship militarism. It's wrong for the prime minister to visit such a place. Other critics note that the men would be perceived as Korean or Chinese are enshrined for the military actions that they affected as Japanese imperial subjects. So basically, they're trying to put all the blame everywhere other than on themselves. And here's some of why this is really important, if you haven't pieced it together already. This is immediately after Hiroshima. The people affected by this bombing, in Japan they're called the Hibakusha of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're looking for compensation from their government. And they really criticize the Japanese government for failing to accept responsibility for having instigated and then prolonged a very aggressive war long after Japan's defeat was apparent, resulting in a very heavy toll in Japanese, Asian, and American lives. Historians have stated that attempts to minimize the importance of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is revisionist history. The mellowing of this history allows the very harsh facts of the history that led to these bombings to be forgotten. There's real lessons to have been learned from this, and they're not being learned because the government in itself officially is trying to negate this history. I just want to check to see what the time is right now. I'm just rambling on here forever, and I apologize for that because I'm not really a public speaker. Most of my job is, my head is in books and libraries and documents and archives and libraries, every now and then interviewing survivors or tracking down photos or films. So this is probably the most talkative I've been in the last 6 months altogether, actually. So it's not just, like I said, the historic revisionism of American Confederacy or the Japanese war crimes. This is happening in Croatia, and the Serbian war crimes of World War II, the Yugoslavia. The Armenian genocide is officially denied by Turkey, and it actually comes to a political head. Anytime America tries to officially recognize the Armenian genocide in the congressional record, Turkey threatens, action as far as the removal from NATO or for trade disruption. They take it very seriously. It's such a blow to their national pride to admit that they took any part in this genocide or that the genocide even existed. That it's just amazing to me. It's over 100 years and they still refuse to admit any kind of a part of this. As you know, during the Soviet era, a lot of historical revisionism and negativism took place. So I could just give thousands of different examples how they tried to fashion their history. The French laws actually, there's actually French laws made in 2005 where they're trying to recognize French colonialism as a positive thing, a very positive value. And then there's what's going on, or what happened in Nazi Germany. There was an attempt, and a very successful one for a while it lasted, in Nazi Germany for the Germans to completely revise official history, not just of what was happening in Germany or before Germany at that time or World War I. I'm talking about going back to classic Greece and even farther, the migration of Aryans from Tibet. The Nazis wanted to put humanity into three groups: the founders of culture, the bearers of culture, and the destroyers of culture. The founders of culture, in Hitler's view, were a biologically distinct Aryan race that he believed were tall, blonde, and originated in Northern Europe. And he believed that in prehistory, the Aryan race had been responsible for all significant developments in human culture, including agriculture, architecture, music, literature, art. And he believed that the modern Germans were descendants of these Aryans and had genetically inherited the Aryans' biological superiority. The destroyers of culture, in Hitler's view, were the Jews, who he regarded not as a genetically diverse population sharing certain ethno-cultural and religious traits as they were widely recognized, but as a unified, biologically distinct race. He believed that wherever Jews went, they damaged and destroyed culture surrounding them. So, in doing this, Himmler was able to use this fake research to fuel and justify the Holocaust. In a 1937 speech, Himmler announced that the bog bodies of northwestern Europe, which testified to an Iron Age tradition where individuals were deliberately killed and deposited in peat bogs, they must represented the eradication of homosexuals. This is just insanity. But they took every instance in history, recorded history, and put their spin on it. What was the real cause? What was really happening? Who was Aryan? In their mind, the ancient Greeks were Aryans, and that the modern Olympics were revised to commemorate the amazing achievements of Aryans past. And this spread to everything. It even spread to religion. They tried to reinvent Christianity and how it started and who the major players were and what was important about it. And they changed Jesus from a Jew to an Aryan. So in German religious doctrine in the 1930s, Jesus was Aryan and not Jewish, and that there was nothing Jewish about the faith at all, other than that they were the ones who ended up killing Christ. So there was, like I said, there was the Germans, the Nazis were absolutely obsessed with reinventing history and eradicating any kind of history that they thought would be contrary and counter to their aims and their views, and just inventing, just fabricating a history to promote their. This is a clip from a film, Olympiad by Leni Riefenstahl. She deliberately tries to mimic this famous statue of the discus thrower. There's actually a lot more on this. I didn't really time this super well, but let's talk a little bit more about it. I was telling you a little bit something about the German Nazi Christian ethic. They called it positive Christianity. It was this movement where they mixed the belief that a racial purity of the German people should be maintained by mixing Nazi ideology with elements of Christianity. So the party represents positive Christianity. It's very non-denominational. They tried to downplay a lot of like the Apostles' Creed, was completely rewritten and changed. According to Nazi anti-Semitism, positive Christianity advocates, they sought to deny, like I said, the Semitic origins of Christ in the Bible. In that faith, the way they presented Christianity, the Old Testament, completely unimportant, and that Christ was not Jewish. Hitler did identify himself as a Christian in Mein Kampf, but really, there's very little evidence to prove this. He was really driven by opportunism. Here's again, I just want to show a little. These are some of the symbols of that Christian movement. There's the classic images of Christ as, as very Aryan, very light-skinned. I don't know if you saw a National Geographic article that was done a while ago. I think it might have been Smithsonian, who tried to give a rendering, but most likely they think Jesus actually looked like, what they knew about people from Galilee and that part of Judea in the first century. And the same thing about Cleopatra. Now, I'm using the Cleopatra to give a very important example of people who revise or negate history, or for the right reasons. I mean, the heart's in the right place, but again, it's very dangerous to do. There's a tradition where people want to ask, well, if Cleopatra was Egyptian and in Africa, that she must have been African and Black African, and an attempt to establish a certain amount of pride in their heritage and in their culture. It's easier to use examples of very famous persons in history and kind of adopt them over to your side in order, again, to create a sense of pride. But again, even though this is it's a positive thought, and and the reasons why they're doing it is right, it's very dangerous to base your heritage, your identity on something that's just not true. Cleopatra was one of the Ptolemy pharaohs. She was Macedonian. She was Greek, almost pure line going back to the time of Alexander's conquest. And so I'm going to just wrap this up a little before we start questions. I know we're ending a little bit early, but I'm hoping there's some questions out there. People ask, I know I covered a lot, but like, why is this important? I talk to some people and I tell them about why it's important that you have to tell the absolute truth in your history. And they'll ask, well, why can I tell a positive story that inspires people? The people tell these stories, that put these stories on Facebook, like some really inspiring story, whether it's secular, religious, and even though it might not be true, why can't I present this as my truth, my history, my heritage? If it helps people to be inspired, or it helps them strive toward a lofty goal, why is it wrong? Well, again, I go back to what I said before, because it's just not true, and you're basing who you are. You're creating an identity based on a lie. Whether you want them to strive for a higher goal or not, you shouldn't have people try to strive toward unrealistic goals. This even goes to like personal history. If you're talking to your children and you say, well, why should I tell my kids if I experimented with any kind of substance or engaged in risky teen behavior? Why do I need to tell them that? Isn't it better that they just strive toward a good role model, and I just tell them that I did not do those things and they should try to strive to be the kind of person I was? My kids don't need to know that my great-grandfather was a slave owner. But again, like I said, you're setting unrealistic expectations in people when you're presenting them with falsehoods, no matter what the reason or your intentions. Now, I'm not going to give a specific example, but there's certain historical sites that have been around for a few hundred years, and they don't want visitors to be told the ugly stories of say the slavery legacy on certain plantations. And they just don't feel that's important. And they'll even point to some what I think are just ridiculous examples. They'll say, well, we have letters that we preserved from that era where the owners were talking about how much their slaves loved them and how happy they were and how much they trusted them and how much they were part of the family. And it's just shocking to me that someone is basing the narrative of the slave owner and the slaveholder as to evidence of how the slaves were treated. But um, I've talked with people about why religion, which I'm not going to delve deep into, it's a little too controversial, but I mean, I have some people who I'm close to, and I tell them about some of the early popes in the Catholic faith, and they say that's not important. You don't need to know that. You just need to know the faith now and how it can help you and you can move forward. And they say you don't really need the absolute truth to understand your faith. You know, I completely disagree with that. I think to understand your faith, you need to know of the positives and negatives so you can move forward. Again, this is just building your castles on sand. And I apologize, I'm rambling a lot. This is not a set speech. So I'm going to give a plug for people who've had a little too much one-sided history in their life, and they want a little bit of the other side, even though it's very much to the other side, and people think it's a very, very dangerous piece of counter history. But there's good old Howard Zinn's book on the people's history of the United States. So I hope everyone one day gets a chance to take a look at that book. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Catherine, I hope that actually, I have no idea if that actually all came across, if people even saw that on their screen. I couldn't get feedback because everyone was muted. So that's actually it. If you want to take over and start any kind of question period.
Sure. First of all, thank you for being an incredible presenter who took over when I disappeared, and were in the middle of your presentation when I ended up being able to get back. So I am so sorry that I disappeared. I may have asked Mary Ann to show up just in case it happened again. Mary Ann, thank you for coming on. Paul, thank you so much. I'm just going to remind everyone, if you would like to submit a question, you can do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So I'm going to give people time to do that. So go ahead and type it, and then I will go ahead and read the question to Paul, and he'll be able to answer. And I actually do. Oh, go ahead, Paul.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I feel like I need to know what you were going to say now.
I'll say it when you're done.
Okay, all right.
It has nothing to do with the presentation.
Oh, okay. All right, I do have, let's see, I have a question here. I saw the "Don't Tread on Me" flag in the modern photos you showed, and I was wondering if that symbol, is that a symbol of white supremacy, because I see it on base all the time?
Not especially, no. It's a Revolutionary War era. A lot of, I think the Tea Party kind of adopted it a few years ago. It's not necessarily white supremacist, but it is used and co-opted by a lot of people who call themselves modern day secessionists, and definitely people who are anti-government and anti-authoritarian. Absolutely.
All right. And then I have another one that says, how are we able to know all of the stuff that happened in history when, hold on, how do we know all of the stuff happened when we don't have cameras? Like, wait, how do we know that things happened without that physical proof?
Okay, well, luckily there is a large historical record out there. Even before the classic era, people kept journals. There's most governments kept official government documentation, and famous letters, poems, histories were written down and copied and sent to various other, they traveled all over the place. I mean, there's a lot of books that were considered missing for 1,000 years found in Arabic in libraries in the East, or books from ancient Greece that were thought to be lost for hundreds of years found in monasteries in Ireland in the early Renaissance. There was a lot of recording going on. And a historian takes things from a lot of different sources. Nothing is taken for face value. There's a lot of visitors. People would come traveling to other countries and go back and write their impressions of what they saw. There were forms of newspaper, as it were. There's church records, and people think there's a scarcity of the historical record out there, but really there's quite a real treasure trove. And a historian goes and looks at as much of it as they can to get as accurate a picture as they can, taking into account that some people have agendas. So some people will try to put something out there for a purpose of propaganda, positive or negative, but when taken with what we know from that era, and it's also in conjuncture with other sciences and with other disciplines. A good historian also looks at geology and the historical record and biology. What was happening in that era? Was there a drought that year? Was there a great fire or flood that year? Absolutely affects the history, and you get a much richer view of it. There's research done on microbes and germs and the history of disease that can be gathered through a lot of disciplines, not necessarily strictly history, that helps support and enhance the historical record. So there's so much out there. There's a lot of holes, yes. There's a lot of question marks, but for the most part, historians are able to present a very balanced view of what actually happened and why it happened. So that was a bit rambling, sorry.
All right, I have, what do you think about the tearing down or peaceful removal of Confederate statues?
My personal opinion, not the view of the museum or anything. This is just me, and I could be completely wrong, but again, it's important to know history of those statues. A lot of people think, oh, the history of the statues? The history is there was a civil war and this person fought in and they put up a statue. That's really not the reason the vast majority of these statues were actually erected. They were erected in response to the civil rights movement. A lot of the statues that were erected very quickly, very inexpensively, with very cheap materials, across the country, was actually a very conscious effort to counter what was happening concerning African-American civil rights in the country. So knowing that, I think it's a little easier to understand some of the outrage and why are we lauding these people. It's not that they're trying to negate history. A lot of people say, well, they're destroying history when they get rid of these statues. No, they're not getting rid of history. They're getting rid of a very, very cynical attempt several decades ago to negate the real history of what was happening in America at that time. And some of these people, though they fought for maybe what they thought was a good cause, they weren't fighting for a very good cause. They were fighting to, yes, for states' rights, the state's right to hold and keep slaves. It's a very dark history, and there was this myth of this Southern dashing Ashley Wilkes hero out trying to save Dixie is like I said, read the historical record and you get a very different view of it. So, all right, the short answer is, for a lot of these statues, I don't mind. I think maybe the process should have been a little more democratic. They should have gone to the local councils. There should be debate, public forum. To grab a rope around the neck and pull it down, maybe I'm just a old school and a little more genteel. I don't particularly find that appealing.
All right.
But I understand it.
Okay, so in your discussion of Civil War historical negationism, I think I said that wrong. I'm sorry, Paul.
Close enough.
The part of it about the Confederate being on the defensive and not the attackers. So while the war was about slavery and is undeniable, there's no doubt about that horrific nature of that. Being wrong does not in itself justify claiming that they were on the defense. Bull Run is in Virginia. I think the atrocities of slavery justify the Union's attack where it's defined that way. Why do both sides want to claim defense in this case? Who should be called the defense, and is there really an offense and defense in the Civil War?
I'll give a very probably too simplistic an answer, but Abraham Lincoln was defending the Union. It wasn't the North seceding from the United States, so it wasn't the South trying to keep the country together. Like I said, maybe simplistic and a bit crass, but Lincoln and the Union Army was defending the Union, the United States of America. Apologize if that's a cop-out, but that's...
All right. There's any other questions for Paul? We still have some time. And I'm going to go ahead and I can't remember if I put Paul's email address in the chat because I disappeared and that was unhelpful. So I'm going to put that in now just in case, because Paul has said in the past that you are welcome to send him questions if you think of something later or if you want more in-depth information, which we're very grateful for. Thank you, Paul. And yeah. Oh, and I'm just gonna real quick also put a link to our next program that's coming up next week. This is a Be an Unlikely Ally community conversations on race. It'll be watching a TED Talk and then having several members from the community be there to talk about both the justice system and how race affects that. So I'm done with my little part there. Yes. Oh, and there's more questions. Yay. Okay. So, okay. We have 50 years from now. What do you think will be the big story of 2020? Will it be the pandemic, the politics, climate change, statues?
It will be the end of the great experiment of the United States of America. I'm kidding. What were some of the other examples again besides COVID and the election?
Let's see, pandemic, politics, climate change, statues, and then I think kind of a broad etc.
Well, first off, I'm glad you said 50 years because so many people want to try to historically evaluate something in the last few years or even the last decade or even the last 20 years, which I think is extremely dangerous. I think 50 is a good start. It's really when you can be removed enough from it. But I think 2020 might be remembered as the year that finally this confluence of just hubris and ego finally all just came together in a grand ball of tragedy and destruction. For so long, people have not been wanting to admit a certain political belief or a certain scientific fact or a certain or a lack of civility or the importance of money, capitalism over federal socialist programs. Just this, the year that just egos and hubris and pride collided to, I don't know what's actually going to happen after this, but this is the year I think it all came to a head where there has to be some change, or it's business as usual, and this was the beginning of the fall, of the end. Sorry, I'm not as optimistic as others that this is going to last as long as the Roman Empire, which didn't end so well for them either.
And then I have, what is the origin of the word history? Is it his story or is it something else?
No, that's okay. Called a coincidence. You know what? I don't know the etymological definition of it. What a great question. I'm sure that can be a quick Google. But I know that that I know it's definitely Greek, because my favorite book in the world, and that's of all books, and you know how much I love books, Catherine, is the Histories by Herodotus. And if you've never read this book, I'm telling you, it is thrilling. It is captivating. This man, he was the first real historian, and he just went and traveled the known world and just asked questions. What happened here? How did this battle get fought? He would interview the people who actually fought in these famous battles in Greece. And he went and visited the pyramids, and he would ask, how did these get built? A lot of times what he was being told was just complete garbage. That's what the locals told tourists and took their money. But he chronicled it all, and it's just fascinating. And how did the Persian Empire start? How did this king get his throne? And he writes it all down, and the different versions, and they're fascinating. You would not be able to put this book down. I buy this when I see it in used bookstores and give it to friends all the time. Just the Histories by Herodotus. So I know it's an old word. I believe it's Greek. I can't give you the exact etymology of it.
Marianne, being the fabulous librarian she is, was Googling and searching while you were talking. She goes on to say, the short version is that the term history has evolved from an ancient Greek verb that means to know, says the Oxford English Dictionary's Philip Durkin. The Greek word historia originally meant inquiry, the act of seeking knowledge, as well as the knowledge that results from inquiry. And then she goes as far as to link to a Time article about it. Thank you, Marianne.
Wow, very thorough. I knew it was Greek.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul, so much.
Again, I don't, like I said, I'm not a public speaker, and I get plenty of feedback from those close to me and friends who well, you could have slowed down. You shouldn't have rambled so much. Maybe easy on your vocabulary. But I'm not accustomed to this, but I'm very happy to do it, and I find it very fun. And if you enjoyed 5 minutes of it, I'm very pleased. Thank you for giving your time, everyone who has attended this. Go ahead, Catherine.
So I did just go ahead and put the survey in the chat that I mentioned at the beginning. If you would please fill that out, that really does help us figure out how to improve programming. This is the third one that Paul has put on for us. I roped him in doing 3 months in a row, and I think I got him to agree to do another one. Probably
okay.
Give him, I swear I did. But we're going to give him a break. But I just wanted to say thank you for this one, Paul, but also just for doing this for us for the last couple of months. It's been so nice to have you, and it's yeah, thank you so much.
So welcome. Thank you, and thank you all. Good night.